I was, as I was walking up here, and I know that this lecture has a unique time slot for architecture lectures, as in it's right in studio. So the nice thing about that is that this talk is really, I think, about that kind of moment where you're in school, you're being taught by people who are both practicing and writing and doing other things. So in a sense, it's a real privilege to be able to be here at Georgia Tech, period, as a Portman critic, but also to do a lecture that's really a lecture for fellow faculty and students. And I'm going to back up what Scott was saying by saying something that perhaps is a bit unorthodox, which is buildings are rarely transformational. So we're all in school, we're architects, and we learn how to design buildings, we learn how to detail buildings, and then I, at least in my own practice, and I think it's true of most people, find out the terrible truth that buildings actually don't change the world. So, and really that's to say that if you think about all the work you put into a singular project and have the expectation that it's going to affect everything around it, and you look at it that way, you'll never see the change. But I do believe that, in fact, the change happens anyways. You just might not be able to see it. So the lecture is in two parts. First part is a little bit about how design and how cities are a bit of an experiment, and so are projects. And I'm going to go through essentially three modes that you can see here: sand, salt, and sea. And really, the reason I talk about those three things has a lot to do with the issue of opportunity, that we have a chance to build all of this work at a point where the waterfront and water are both scary and a scarcity, and but that has brought up kind of the perfect conditions for architecture. Basically, this public and private dialogue needs essentially, it needs a place, it needs political kind of focus, and it needs a value case or a need where design comes in a sense to make sense of it. And I hope to show you three places that, in a sense, we reframed their definitions as place by doing particular projects in areas. They're all, in this case, they're all in New York City. One is in the Rockaways, which is a beach. One's at the Battery. And finally, one is along the edge of the city on a street called Spring Street. And I'm going to start with sand. And when you think about, and I'm going to talk over this video a bit, when you think about designing something 5.5 miles, and you're an engineer, you might think one way about it, which is how you chop it into pieces and stage it. And as an architect, I think you bring a completely different perspective in it. I think, yeah, is this moving? Let's see. Let me try the next one. There we go. Can anyone hear that? No, so I'm going to talk over it. So I'm showing you this project from drone photography from the air, because it brings really the essential question, which is an architectural one, which is how do you design a line that's 5.5 miles long? It's really a kind of straightforward question when you think about it that way. And in many complex projects, which infrastructure is, there's usually something behind it that's simpler and more basic that is absolutely necessary for architects to be involved, even though many of these projects do not involve architects. So we were able to, and again, this is due to a project that when a project comes after essentially the slate is wiped clean, it's an important moment to bring back to people what was there before, not only with nostalgia, but really with what kind of essential qualities you want to bring back. And I think it was the case of the Rockaways. And so speaking of comfort stations, one of the first projects that we had done there was this kind of comfort station, which anyone who's gone to a park knows they're required. And this is in the Rockaways, which is a very urban, very challenged neighborhood from kind of its resources. And all we ever heard was, it's going to have to be really secure and you can't use glass. So the reaction to that was to actually make something out of that. Probably the most unglassy comfort station you'll ever find. So instead of using glass, we added a piece at the end, which I call the towel, which faces the beach, that allows for kind of place-making, collective, but it allows the landscape to grow through the building. So these are earlier on. At this point, the landscape's grown up a bit, but it also did something very interesting. I'll go back. When Sandy hit, the building had a lot of holes in it, which meant that the structure actually performed very well. So there was no damage to this building. It opened 2 weeks before Storm Sandy in New York. The kind of planning that went into originally remaking a parking lot into the park, which was the sort of political opportunity. There was money that went to 5 parks. No one thought about storms really, but they were really thinking about how parks bring neighborhoods together. And as architects, we were trying to figure out what a beach park looked like amongst a team of landscape architects and graphic designers, and what role architecture played. And very early on, we were looking at shade structures as ultimately, whether you're in in Miami, or whether you're in a New York park or in California, shade structures are kind of the language of beaches. And they tend to be, if you don't make them out of a lot of small pieces, very hard to kind of stage on a beach. So in a sense, construction on beaches can be very challenging. So we tried to propose how to do these massive structures out of smaller pieces of steel, and in this case, wood. So this was a kind of idea of a wood trellis. This is another view back to the beach and how people use it to cut through, and in the end, how these trellis structures are kind of open to interpretation. So we're now to the specifics. So that was Rockaway as a park. That was the project that we did. But in every project, there's really a community that you're doing your project in. Let's see if I can do this. And so when the boardwalk was destroyed and it became clear there was both money and collective will to rebuild it, kind of like Katrina in New Orleans, there's always a period after this where half the people in the room say, let's not rebuild, and the other half of the people in the room say, we must rebuild. And that may be different a decade from now, but as architects, I think it was an important lesson for me, both in following what happened in Katrina and then when Sandy hit in New York, was to suspend, I'll call it, jumping to conclusions without the evidence starting to pile up. And I think as we all go through going forward, a lot of change and turmoil, which we actually have been going through, but it's hard to acknowledge. I think it's important architecturally to see what some of the kind of forces, whether they be financial, whether they be political, or whether they be even environmental, start to stack up. So at a certain point, it became clear that people were not going to be moved away from the Rockaways, even though primarily social housing and many other nursing homes were there and shouldn't be there. those things, the city was not willing to change it. So a decision was made that the boardwalk should get rebuilt. Now, there's a picture of it completely destroyed. You can kind of see just the structure was left. And again, this is something, you have to imagine it, that's wood, concrete piers and piles, and way too low. And kind of looks like this, except much of it is in people's living rooms. That means that you have to get back and talk to people about what they're willing to approve. At the same time, you have environmental regulations, in this case in New York, that do not allow you to use wood. So you have a problem. People's desires and dreams, the word boardwalk, right? What does that conjure up? Boards. And so it's especially compelling, I think, in architecture to know that there's a role for ideas at the very beginning that will allow all of the other things to line up behind them. So there was an opportunity to do planning at the same time as doing essentially project solution making. So the funding for doing a plan for all the parks in the Rockaways, we did concurrently with the boardwalk. And I'm showing you images from this. And you can see these images of the Bayside, which is equally as vulnerable, are trying to convey really an idea of utility, let's say a place for people to get into the water with kayaks, and a kind of everyday use of a nature trail in the foreground. So in terms of images, and how are these images different than, let's say, images, any landscape architecture of nice images you see in a magazine? The specific role of these images was to say, let's say in this case, you could walk to school, if you're in the Rockaways, along a nature trail, and how do we make these trails feel like, what if this is our dream, right, to how do we make this possible? And one of the ways to first model that was to create a kind of people's way back out of the boardwalk in order for the rest of the projects to be imagined as being more public than they were previously. In many cases, many of these public parks, different pieces of the neighborhood have, over the years, regarded them as very private spaces. So if you look at the whole map of this place, there's an area in the middle that's a blue line, and you can see this was done in phases, and one of the key elements doing anything in a phase is to come up with a system. So this is perhaps one of the unique things that design can contribute is how to make beautiful systems. And I would really stress that kind of form and kind of language of architecture are so important in terms of designing systems that will last the kind of 50 and 100 years that these are expected to last. So you can probably tell from this image that it's spelling out something. So it's spelling out Rockaway. We first thought this would just be a bunch of signs, right? We just put signs like in beaches at the end of the street, and there'd be an R, and or we would on the boardwalk do big letters, paint them on. But as this evolved, we realized that there was a kind of idea of being a tourist in your own neighborhood, or having something like the Hollywood sign, or if you think about Rio and that amazing pattern, that's having something in the Rockaways that went beyond people, simply the utility of riding a bike on it. So the kit of parts, I want to explain a little bit, is key, that it's kind of, that the structure of it is repeatable. And so it's essentially 5 structural pieces of precast, essentially a bridge. Hopefully the mic is still working. And that there are these P1 through 6, and that it essentially makes when you look closely at it, it looks like it's just making a kind of S wave. But when you're on the boardwalk, and you can see the pieces going in, it makes really a wavy line. So it gets back to this idea of how do you design a line. And maybe one of the first answers, breakthroughs we had is, maybe we design a line that's not straight, because the environmental regulations meant that the overall shape of the boardwalk could not change. So the question is, how could we change people's perceptions of it when the outline couldn't change? So you could see it goes together kind of like a big giant Lego kit. And again, the surface and color are integral to the structure. This is completely an engineering structure. This is, if I walked away from this, and my friend who was the structural engineer on this, Dominica, stepped up, she'd say, that is my structure. Okay, and this is her structure. But even on a kind of dull day, that structure starts to do something at a very large scale. And you saw from the drone photography that it's also reading not only as these sort of squiggly lines that give you hints about things, but it also has this typography. So one of the things we wanted to do was, after Sandy, and they're actually starting to come in now, only now. So that was 2012. It's now 2017, and Google has finally gotten its act together, and the satellite photos now show Rockaway when people are checking it out. So because, in a sense, people said, well, I might be able to see that from the top of my apartment building, but really, how meaningful? I can barely figure this out when I'm riding my bike. It kind of looks like a Y, but you're telling. But since then, it's become apparent that more people own drones. They check out satellite photographs when they're visiting a place. So the audience, the definition of why this would be useful, or the value case for it, also changed. So the other key piece of this is the landscape, not the board. So imagine the big problem, in a sense, so we said there was a problem in the line. We also said the problem was not focusing on it, the boardwalk itself, but focusing on the landscape. So by demanding that this was a dune walk, not a boardwalk, we got the funding to create an additional dune, so an added dune to what the Army Corps was doing to create 2 dunes. And I think for landscape architects, that's sort of that double dune system is really what you need to kind of self-reinforce beach. And so in the end, this is the sort of section of the diagrammatic section. The railings are not necessary, I have to say, but and no architect wants them, we didn't want them, but they're there because in the event of a storm, all of this dune gets washed away. And then their feeling was, since the boardwalk is much higher, then legally they would be responsible for people falling off of it, which I still find really ironic. And so in addition to the dune on the beach side, there's a dune on where you see the steps there, upland. So sometimes there's steps and sometimes there's dunes. And so there's a series of plantings that is out there and been growing. Probably this opened a year ago. This is its 2nd year. It's not completely finished. Phase 6 is happening now. So this summer will be the actual opening. I show this to you because this is a rendering, and it's showing the work of a number of other architects who at the time did the emergency intervention. So there's some lifeguard stations that were done kind of by the city that are now going to be used, the prototype as emergency shelter. There was some arbors, and the same graphic designer from Pentagram did graphics on those buildings. But ultimately, the kind of task of the boardwalk itself depended really on coming up with like a door and window language, a language of how to make access points to it. And these I'm showing you from the land side, from the neighborhood, accessible for the ADA, but something more, like something that if you're carrying your surfboard works, or trying to move your bike up, or have a stroller. So the idea was to kind of think about those places, as small as they are, like simply a seat wall, an extra seat wall, as also helping reinforce the dune. In addition to, so you can see the kind of sketch of how these kind of sloped surfaces or straight surfaces, kind of these architectonic forms that reinforce it. On the beach side, there's only one type of beach access, and this is a real challenge, and it's going to be true of beaches all over the United States, is that most of what, including in California, we build on beaches or have built, were built in the 60s and 70s. The ADA wasn't there, so people now in wheelchairs and people that are challenged, even temporarily, still want to go to the beach, and they're not particularly accessible. So there's an industry that's come up with mats to make that, they're called Moby mats, but actually if you build something permanent, it has to be accessible. So what we did in this case was squeeze out an ultra big landing, which we call a porch, in order to get some definition of threshold into the boardwalk. And this curvy line is working with the shape of how the sand is moving, so it's also reinforcing the dune to a degree. And that's how we were able to argue for not just a straight ramp off the boardwalk. And in this case, it's all recycled plastic lumber. So you can see in the renderings how we kind of tried to make a case for that. And in the case of your two neighbors, for people living in their ground floor apartments that now are looking at a wall, equally, you're also making the case to them that they're part of this larger system, and that while the stairs will be located close, and so it gets into this kind of idea that although nothing is perfect, everything you design actually has a series of consequences that you can't completely control. So you can see the whole system there, and the kind of seating, and the sort of real kind of version of someone kind of using it. And actually, people surf, by the way, people in New York City surf in the winters, just if you're interested in coming to work in New York and want to surf. And then I spoke a little bit about this porch. So the usual accoutrements, just like in any building project, where do you put them? And one of my favorite analogies is in the Villa Savoie, when you first walk in, there's a sink there as you enter. And you can think to yourself, why is there a sink and I feel like, in a way, the shower stall, the drinking fountain, we got to design these drinking fountains, and now they're being produced, are that same kind of, here, have some water, bit of welcome in the beach. And they're located in a way that with seating, looking out in the water, but also to kind of welcome people coming in and off the beach. And you can see these drinking fountains. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about this system as an alphabet. So the fonts, the idea of making a shape as an architect, right? Determining that shape will result in a certain kind of wiggle, right? Or wave. Also was interesting when Paula Scher of Pentagram said, I can make a font out of this. Of course, getting people to make blue precast concrete was difficult, but it does, it's interesting perspective to think about something that is both literal and not literal, and yet is a real point of pride in the Rockaways now. And for those who have taken graphic design, there's always something that's called the bag test or the t-shirt test, and whether, in a way, the brand will pass the t-shirt test. The other kind of wrinkle that we managed to put into this was an experimentation with a material that in cities is actually hard to use, and it's much easier in places like campuses and rurally, which is glow-in-the-dark material. So there's a whole set of paints and aggregates out there now that absorb light, kind of like your old glow-in-the-dark toys when you were a kid, and then emit light in the evening. So we managed to get in these blue letters a fair amount of glow-in-the-dark aggregate. And you can't really, interestingly enough, because there's still a lot of light required from the lights, you can't really photograph it. It's not that strong. But it is strong in the sense of it kind of has something coming out from it that's a bit indescribable, and it relates to really what's happening on the beaches, which is the sea life that is shedding its cells and it's coming up, and it's really that photoluminescence that we're all kind of see in oceans and beaches. And so the idea was to kind of bring that kind of biological photoluminescence response onto the boardwalk and see if there would be any kind of effect. So this is the glass aggregate, the recycled glass that's in the ramps. And, but you have to go out there to actually see they're little, they look like white aggregate, and then at night they turn blue. You can get this glow in the dark right now most reliably in a kind of blue cast or a green cast. Okay, so C. So this is a project that is not in the sea, but it's by the harbor. It's a project that our office, we're not an office that has done a lot of carousels. But in doing a master plan for this park, we realized that there's a reason why dark, kind of 50s era parks that fence their trees and that are full of, vendors or kind of low-performing park benches are not necessarily appealing to people who are moving into neighborhoods, especially downtowns, for the first time. So this sea glass carousel took about 10 years to realize because it's really a unique, one-of-a-kind thing, but it's very tied to its place, which is literally at the site of the first aquarium in New York City and one of the first aquariums in the United States, right here at the Battery. And you can see that kind of fort is Castle Clinton, and that was the home of the New York Aquarium. And so one of our first thoughts was moving light tends to attract people, so we're thinking buy a regular carousel, make a cool enclosure for it, we'll be done. And the interesting thing about people who are visionary in the public realm, which Worry Price is that she had a different idea, which is if you just did another object in a public park, you don't take advantage of the fact that here you are at downtown, there's no other park like this. This is where you actually get on ferries to go to the Statue of Liberty. There is 4 million people who walk through this. Now, maybe they don't notice what they're walking through, or they didn't 10 years ago. And maybe it's not important for a city to kind of make a front porch garden. But in her case, she came from Texas, from San Antonio, and kind of grew up on the Lady Bird Johnson kind of gardens and felt that New York City didn't understand what a garden was or how important plants were. And so for us, that chanced as architects to make it about the garden was really interesting. So you can see we developed all of the furniture and the architecture for the park. And in this case, I always put this picture up because I feel like if you design an environment that someone feels comfortable enough in a city, in public, to take a nap in, it's a form of success. And I realize there's another interpretation to that, and there are many homeless people that live in this park. But again, because of the quality of the park, there's a dialogue between people who need the park and people who are enjoying the park because of its contemplative. So the park went from kind of looking actually even worse than this picture. You can see the comfort station, to a kind of revival through architecture, and through architecture almost, again, as system. So these elliptical kiosks were also a kind of prototype system we developed. You can see the early sketches of them, of trying to kind of look at cities like Paris or London who have very unique approaches to park architecture. And so part of what we're motivated to do was shift that conversation. This was right before the High Line, or quite well before the High Line happened. So this was the first garden that Pete Outolf, who designed the gardens for the High Line, did in New York, and second, he did the Lurie Garden in Chicago. So our sense was, if it's only the landscape and the architecture doesn't kind of merge to become something with it, there would be a lost opportunity for kind of making kind of this park something really for the whole city. Because in this case, it needed to be, go beyond a neighborhood park. And so the project, though, I want to show you, has a garden designed by Pete Adolf that was paid for, actually, by the Tiffany Foundation. And what's interesting about it is that it tries to be as ocean-like as a garden can be. So if you visit it, it's kind of interesting. And the idea of the carousel was to put everything, all the machines below, but to create many axes of motion. So you do it with wheels and turntables so that you could create this yaw. Essentially, it's kind of like more like coming out of boat technology, but the idea was that, fine, you can go around, but if you could actually get a kind of swivel to happen, you could get a sense of weightlessness out of it. And it's really more of a tool. It's not really a finished work at this point. It's only had 1 or 2 rides designed for it. The hope is the future, many artists will come in and essentially change the motion, change the lighting. So in a sense, we made something that, again, was a system for others to work with. And these show really the kinds of drawings. Although we did it in BIM, we had to then export everything into 2D. This project was done with Mark Simmons, who many of you have had as a professor. It was probably one of his earlier projects. And the interesting thing was trying to work out, for a while we thought we were going to get smart glass, where the glass also could dim, that it could be electrified and dim. In the end, we didn't do that because the piece of glass were too big. But it required, for something that actually you look at as an architect is relatively simple, which is an open air structure. We had ambitions for it to kind of do better than its outdoor environment. So the idea was, both acoustically, but also in terms of climate control, to design louvers and then an exhaust fan at the top, so that it would be like the carousel itself would act like a big fan. So it would be like a fan going in the park. So the energy being used for it essentially would also cool the environment, so that the equipment, but also the riders. A lot of carousels that are enclosed, that because you need to make enough money, you need to run them in New York through the winter, are essentially air conditioned, which would have been, you'd need a vast amount of energy to do it. So the idea was to try and use kind of the natural movement of the carousel. And Burrow Happold, the engineers kind of both figured out a kind of louver system that would essentially use the fan and speed up the air to do this. And that's why in the end, it kind of doesn't look as simple as these renderings, which is what we started. But in fact, this sort of machine in the garden is really a lot of machine, considering. And that the figures in the end were one of the more difficult things. And we collaborated with someone who was trained as an architect, George Seepin, but designs operas. He also designed the Broadway show for Little Mermaid. And he kind of, again, it's really a lot about collaboration, but he looked at the project, and we had sort of clear dolphins as the sort of stand-in. And he looked at it and he said, I think you have it backwards. You are the fish. You're not sitting on the fish, which I thought was really an incredible insight. And something that we were then able to develop with him to essentially create figures that were apertures, so you really were in the fish figure. And equally with kind of even designing the lighting system was to, again, instead of you go into a theater like this, and generally you see these giant arrays of lights and projectors that are kind of really horrifying, and then architects, we try and hide them. So in this case, we really try to optimize them and create a kind of shape that worked with the roof, but also offered full coverage for all the projected surfaces. So when you go in, there's a kind of projected water that you're in, and there's a kind of a lighting control. And it has very different day and nighttime personalities. Okay, and you can see that where it is. Okay, finally in this part, and I'm going a little bit slow, so I'm going to speed up, is salt. So salt, like how much do we all overlook salt, right? And salt, as everyone knows, used to be traded like gold, and it's still absolutely essential for human life. At the same time, in New York City, we import salt from Chile in big boats, pile it in buildings, and when snow hits, we put it in vehicles, and they race around New York, throw salt on streets to melt snow. The other thing we do in New York City, we don't have enough room to hide our garbage trucks. And we produce such a huge amount of garbage that we have fleets of garbage trucks and street cleaners all over the city. And what happens is that no one wants them in their neighborhoods, right? Garbage trucks smell. So when we were first working on this project, and I'm sort of going through the two pieces of it here quickly with some photography. When we first did this project, there was a giant lawsuit. Even though it had gone through all of its public approvals, it was part of the city's larger waste management plan. The first thing that happened is the property owners next door that wanted to develop residential condominiums, even though the entire area is zoned industrial, sued. And they sued the city. They actually sued 2 or 3 times. And the city's response, because we have a strong mayor system in New York, and in this case, the mayor agreed with the head of city planning and agreed with that they were going to stay the course, they were going to buy this site from UPS, and they were going to let UPS stay there, and they were going to tear down the old tiny garage and build a salt shed there. And so what happened was we met with city planning, and we did this with Datner Architects and WXY, so it's was a very large project at that point for our firm, but they do a lot of sanitation work. And they said to us, just make a good building, and we will deal. You'll still have to go through all the approvals, but we have no intention of this project not happening. And what happened is there's a lot of architects in these kinds of projects on both sides of the table. So there was a public design commission, and when they saw what sanitation for the salt shed wasn't going to use architects, at the beginning they were just going to put a big tent there, or one of those metal sheds that you've seen. And the Public Design Commission said, this is at a gateway to the waterfront, there needs to be some architecture. So the question was, what is the architectural question about a building that no one except if they're in a truck will go into, that is essentially outdoors and people will walk by all the time. So the response from all of us was to make it about salt, because that's what's inside it, is to create something that dealt not with the dissolving power of salt, right, which you could have taken that approach, which is, oh yeah, salt dissolves. And so we took that approach actually for the garage piece, was to deal with the idea that salt is actually a crystalline element, and as a structure is incredibly stable. And to put the idea out there that essentially the stability of our public shared functions is what's at stake in public buildings. And I show this picture of Meryl Euclides, who is an artist, who's being the artist in residence at sanitation. In a sense, we knew that sanitation actually believed that too, because most of their investment to date isn't in buildings, although even ugly buildings are as expensive as buildings that are architecturally resolved. But their investment is in people. They have a real sense that what they do is important, and they have a lot of camaraderie in terms of people. So we felt that doing these two buildings, and you can see there's the salt shed and there's the garage, and it's right on the edge of a highway where a lot of people go by, that this was a chance for sanitation to essentially take the front seats. That there they were, and instead of hiding, which is that really most of their buildings kind of get hidden in industrial areas, was to try and figure out how the bigger piece could show the flows, their flows of activity better, and the smaller piece could be about the idea of immovable public investment in shared, in kind of things that we do better together than alone, right? So I can promise you, organizing as a group of people to pick up garbage and to do snow is much better than all of us going out there and being assigned pieces of streets, at least in New York. I don't know how it works in Atlanta. And so that was something I think everyone could agree on. And so even the neighbors, including many celebrities like Laurie Anderson, who were part of this lawsuit, I got a chance to kind of walk her through this project right after it opened. And she was kind of dazzled by it in a sense. She thought the salt shed was like the best museum space in the city that had been built in a while. But it also performs, this doesn't look like Atlanta, right? This also performs in the extreme conditions it's supposed to perform in. And that it has a kind of acceptance of its scale, and this has a lot to do, I think, with form and proportion, on both sides, and this is the rest of UPS, and even as the project to our right will eventually be kind of retail and high-end condominiums. It's been announced recently that this will be towers with essentially these buildings can stand up to still being part of the city. And this is kind of the man spaces. And what I want to point out in showing you our earlier renderings, even though the end is slightly different, and the brick looks slightly different, there was always this idea that people could tell where human activity was happening. So where you see that green and at the corner is, in fact, these louvers are controlled by a motor, and they track the sun so that they close when there's too much sun hitting the windows. And so they constantly are moving, especially towards the end of the day and the middle on the south, so that there's a sense of something happening in a building that's essentially unmanned or static. And equally, the kind of scale of the people spaces, you can see the office spaces to the right are kind of mezzanine into what's a 35-foot clear floor-to-floor height in this building. So these buildings, all photographs make these building sizes look small, but these buildings really do feel like museums, actually. And I would say that if one of these days we manage to pay enough and figure out how to not produce as much garbage, that our hope was that these two structures would still be valuable to people, and there would be other ways to use them. And I think that's kind of what's important about thinking about typology not as an end in itself. And this is Meryl Euclid's, and to end the Meryl Euclid story, she's got the first, it's still up, solo show the Queens Museum has ever done, and that's the first show of her work, and it's actually an incredibly moving show if you were ever in New York. And also the Salt Shed got the first ever fashion event. This is Heron Preston, at the Salt Shed, and they asked him in particular because he's a no-waste fashion designer, and New York City has embarked on an initiative to eliminate New York City's sending waste to any landfill, including Virginia and other places, by 2030. So I want to just do the time is moving on, but I want to do the last piece of this, kind of more about kind of thinking about planning and kind of both the plan of architecture and planning. So this shows just Salt Shed, and we obviously can look at buildings as powerful as icons, this was from a New York Times article, The Shapes of New York. And we can kind of look outside, here's a website of all this stuff and not really understand it. But actually, some of the questions that are these big, giant questions that we think we can't solve, I believe are very much in our power to work on. So I think some of the work that we've been doing lately is something Atlanta, you are all deal with all the time, which is what I call the parking space. So it's as true here as it is in the East Coast, which is your average car is only used 5% of the day. So what do we all think it's doing the rest of the time? I mean, it's being stored somewhere, right? And we architects have to figure out where that is. So Uber is, I use Uber all the time in Atlanta, Lyft, other things. It's become, people have become are starting to realize that as much as we think we can solve everything by changing people's behavior, it's a lot easier to get them to do stuff they want to do anyways, like take an Uber instead of driving their car and not being able to talk to their friends on the phone easily, or being worried about where to park a parking space. So knowing that, basically the transportation sector produces about 30% of our carbon emissions, and a lot of it is just basically personal vehicles. Oh, next one. That quicker than trying to kind of change zoning or land use might be to change our relationship to cars. And I say that kind of as an architect. So part of what some of the projects that we're doing are actually what I call programs. So instead of building something, we will run a program and see what happens. I'm going to explain a little bit what that means. So for BMW, we kind of spent the last year, 2 years, meeting with developers and talking to developers about whether it would be useful for them if we could get the cities to agree to reduce the number of required parking spaces, and a developer can offer a personal building level car share from BMW with electric vehicles, and BMW has an app, it's very fun. And what would that take, and what would the city agree to? So the first test case of that is in New York City in Battery Park City, which does not have required parking anyways at the Solaire. And in New Rochelle now, New Rochelle has put in their building code that if you have car share in your building, you can reduce to a third of the parking spaces. To us, that's not very much, because our research shows that actually it's easily 12. Like you could easily reduce by 12 parking spaces, and I'm sure there's lots more to argue about it. But that the car doesn't necessarily have to change shape to hit, for people, a lot of value of not necessarily needing to own a car anymore, and also then it gets plugged into these other systems. So the other program that we ran, that we're hoping someone else will run, not us forever, was this thing called Eevee Tourism. So the idea was you can take a train, you have an app, and we designed this app for them. It's not super attractive, but it's clear. And you'll get a reduced train ride. You'll get a key to unlock your electric vehicle when you hit Beacon or Storm King or an art park you want to go to up in Massachusetts. This was all for New York State, so it was just tourist things in New York State. And then you get in your electric car, you take it around, you return it, you get back on the train, and not only have you not generated the amount of carbon you would have otherwise, but you've had a reduced rate ride and you got to go to Beacon. Same thing with this, there's a company that makes pedestals. Who here eats from food trucks? Anyone here eat from food trucks? Okay, so you know how food trucks run diesel engines, and it's really nasty because they have to keep their equipment going? So there's a simple fix to that, which is you have a pedestal. The pedestal is basically using electric energy or coming from a clean source, and a food truck could plug in, or ambulances or anything else. So we've kind of, we rolled this out in East Hampton, and we're now rolling out the idea of essentially electric pedestals in other places. And then finally, some of these other images that you can see here called electric vehicle parking. Because of this work and running some of these studies and programs, it's now required in New York City, and you can reduce the number of parking spaces you're planning for, if you're planning a parking lot, if you have electric vehicle charging in them. So this kind of then gets back down to our own projects. So we were in the middle of doing a parking lot project for New York City, which we were designing as a giant bioswale, but we managed to, the only way we were convinced the city itself is we pointed out that in the building code, you're now required to do electric vehicle charging. And we sort of felt guilty because we knew it was our fault that it's in the code and no one knows about it. But at the same time, it sort of proves this larger point that a parking space can actually, even reducing it by 2 or 3, can have lots of positive consequences into the future. And I'm just going to not show much on the Strand, but talk a little bit about the kind of diagramming the value case. So I think that one of the things that's the most important takeaway from our work is that both the users, the public, and the private sector ultimately all have to have reasons for wanting to do things. And that as architects, our real kind of talents are at being able to do that and be able to create, not through just words, but forms that people actually feel connected to and desire. So I'm going to kind of leave this with a quick final thing on, so I do a lot of lectures and I never include this last part, but I'm going to in this case since it's, which is, so what is this community engagement stuff about? What is this engagement? So it's very much connected to what I just talked about, which is the kind of underlying value case, which is in order to even figure out what those issues are and those kind of, for users, for the public, you actually have to find ways to find out from people what they are really challenged by. And it doesn't matter who your client are. And so the classic thing is you have a client, you have a consultant team, you go after a proposal, you kind of know where it's funded from. So I'm taking you through this sort of big project called the Brooklyn Strand. You get lots of partners, you kind of, then you have to go back and say, what is it that you guys were doing anyways? But then you have to somehow transmit to all of these other people. And it gets to this part that sometimes is harder. And sometimes as architects, I think we treat it like it's, like we may be listening, but we're not hearing. And in a sense, I have to say that most of the important facts of a project, if it's planned properly, will come out of a true engagement in situ, whether it's doing site walks, whether it's role-playing through options, whether it's simply hanging around a place long enough that you can observe it through a 48-hour cycle. Most of the facts that stick come out of this process. And so it's not really something you do after, it's something that you actually have to do in order to do. And out of that come not just reading the challenges and opportunities out of the leaflet you were getting at the beginning of the project, but actually presenting the real challenges and opportunities, and then having a kind of iterative relationship that results in, what we would call an action plan. So in the case of the Brooklyn Strand, which I didn't show you the movie of, but it's up there in the gallery so you can watch it. It was actually a project that we instigated to think about how to not remove a highway. This gets back to our parking lots, and not how to remove a highway, but how to think about all the space around what was the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway a different way, and not think about a piece of infrastructure as a buffer, but what to do with it. So I'm going to end with some, not advice, but in a way just a little reflection about what I've been thinking about lately. And some of it has to do with the way I was educated, but I think seeing is critically important in architecture, but in light of how much information we're supposed to look at and how many images per minute we're supposed to look at is newly challenging, and maybe part of our discipline is to actually come up with new techniques to see again. So I'm going to read a quote from Einstein that he said quite famously, "Knowledge is limited to all we know now and understand, while imagination embraces the entire world and all that there will ever be to know and understand." And I kind of mentioned sand and sea before, and this is, if anyone wants to research, there's the kind of world, and it was a Victorian world, of the display of diatoms. And I think people didn't know what they were, except that they were under a microscope, incredibly beautiful. And actually, they're the reasons we have beaches. And they're also, even though we architects spend most of our time designing for land, most of the earth is actually water. Actually, most of our bodies is actually water too. And these little things that you only see under a microscope have an amazingly, like probably a bigger effect on the environment, to get back to my first point, that any building you ever design will ever have. So in the last 10 to 15 years, scientists have realized that diatoms are really the carbon capture mechanism on the planet. So in a sense, potentially our kind of future, well, I don't know about methane, but at least for carbon, is to actually look even more closely at what's available to us out there in terms of knowledge. And I think that that kind of gets to the next thing about looking, is to actually be able to look at and research in a way that goes beyond what you're literally seeing or what you think you're seeing. And kind of here they are. And then finally, I think many of you will have the capability of inventing these new ways to see, and I hope to see more of that in the future. But I think it's a real call for all of us, with the challenges we have now of so many images, to actually figure out how to look at things in a new way. So I'm going to leave you this last little, oh, I missed the diatome movie. He's so cute. Okay, let's see if I can make him move. There we go. Okay, thank you. I don't know if you guys have any questions, or if we should just go to the gallery and you can ask me.
No questions. So, Claire, thanks for an amazing talk. So the gallery opening is right now, so we should all just move up and then you can talk more forward. So thanks, Claire.
Great, thank you.